Imagine building a tank so powerful, so dominant, that you believe nothing on the battlefield can truly stop it. A titan of steel, with armor that laughs at enemy shells and a gun that punches through anything it faces. And then, one day, a supposedly inferior enemy tank, one you've consistently dismissed, rolls onto the field. Suddenly, it's not just bouncing shells anymore. It's tearing through your mighty armor as if it were paper, with a new, secret weapon you never saw coming. That's not a fantasy. That's exactly what happened in the closing months of World War II, a story of technological surprise and a brutal awakening for the German war machine. For much of World War II, especially after the initial shock of the T-34 on the Eastern Front, German tank design philosophy took a sharp turn. They aimed for superiority, for tanks that could dominate the battlefield, one-on-one. This pursuit led to the creation of beasts like the Tiger, and perhaps even more significantly, the Panther. When the Panther rolled out, it was a marvel of engineering, a terrifying machine that truly shifted the balance of power in tank-and-tank engagements. Its sloped armor was revolutionary, effectively making it much thicker than its actual measurement, and its high-velocity, 7.5 centimeters KWK 42L70 gun, was a cannon of incredible power, capable of penetrating almost any Allied tank at long range. German tank crews, seasoned and confident, quickly learned to trust their Panthers. They knew that facing a Sherman, even the later models, usually meant a victory for them. They could engage from distances where the Sherman's 75mm gun, and even initially the new 76mm gun, simply couldn't touch their frontal armor. This created a sense of invincibility, a deeply ingrained belief that the Panther was the king of the battlefield, untouchable by the ubiquitous American M4 Sherman. This confidence was not unfounded. For a long time, it was the harsh reality. The problem, from the Allied perspective, was stark and brutal. When American troops landed in Normandy, they quickly encountered the Panther in significant numbers. The reports from the front lines were grim. Sherman crews, brave and determined, found themselves in a David and Goliath struggle, where David often didn't even have a chance to throw his stone. The standard M for Sherman, armed with its reliable 75mm gun, was primarily designed to support infantry, to engage soft targets, and to fight older German tanks like the Panzer IV. It did those jobs well. But against a Panther, the 75mm gun was largely useless from the front. Its shells would simply ricochet off the Panther's sloped glacis plate, or bounce harmlessly off its thick turret front. To knock out a Panther, a 75mm Sherman often had to get around to the flanks or rear, a dangerous and often suicidal maneuver in a direct engagement. This led to immense frustration and fear among tank crews. They felt outgunned, outarmored, and frankly, outmatched. The call for more firepower was immediate, loud, and desperate. The response from American ordnance engineers was the 76mm M1 gun. This was a longer, higher velocity cannon designed specifically to improve the Sherman's anti-tank capabilities. It was a step up, no doubt. When the first 76mm armed Shermans, like the M4A 376W, started arriving in Europe in the summer of 1944, there was a glimmer of hope. Finally, a Sherman that could fight back. But that hope was quickly tempered by reality. While the 76mm gun, could penetrate a Panther's side or rear armor at reasonable ranges, and it was certainly more effective than the 75mm against the front of a Panzer IV, it still struggled against the Panther's formidable frontal armor. At typical combat ranges, say 800 to 1,000 yards, the 76mm M1, firing its standard armor-piercing AP round, still had a very hard time reliably penetrating the Panther's glacis plate, or even its gun mantlet. The angled armor was just too effective, and the sheer thickness was still too much for the round's kinetic energy to overcome consistently. Sherman crews still found themselves having to perform risky flanking maneuvers, or relying on overwhelming numbers and the element of surprise. The improvement was real, but it wasn't the decisive game-changer everyone had hoped for against the Panther. The German tank crews continued to hold their superior position, confident that their Panthers, even when facing the new Sherman, were still largely invulnerable from the front. They had every reason to believe this. Their experience on the battlefield confirmed it time and again. The 76mm Sherman was better, but not much better when it came to truly challenging the Panther head-on. This left the Allies in a precarious position. They had numerical superiority in tanks, but their primary tank, the Sherman, was still at a distinct disadvantage against the best German armor. Losing too many tanks and crews to Panthers and Tigers was unsustainable. They needed something more, something that could truly level the playing field, even if it was just for a limited number of rounds. The answer lay in a sophisticated new type of ammunition, one that had been in development for some time, and which would eventually be known as HVAP high-velocity armor-piercing, or, in its more technical designation, armor-piercing composite rigid, APCR. This wasn't a completely new concept. The Germans themselves had experimented with similar subcaliber rounds early in the war, like their AP-40 rounds for their 50mm guns, primarily for anti-tank rifles and light tank guns. But the Allied version, particularly the M93 HVAP round for the 76mm M1 gun, was about to unleash a shockwave across the Western Front. The HVAP round was a clever piece of engineering designed to maximize penetration. Unlike a standard armor-piercing round, which is a solid piece of metal, an HVAP round is different. Imagine a tiny, incredibly dense dart, usually made of tungsten carbide, a very hard and heavy metal, encased within a lighter, softer aluminum or steel jacket. When the gun fires, the entire assembly leaves the barrel. But once it's clear of the muzzle, the lighter outer jacket, often referred to as a sabot, though technically a PCR, is slightly different from a PDS sabot rounds. The concept of a subcaliber penetrator is similar, falls away. What continues on its trajectory is just the small, dense subcaliber core, flying at an incredibly high velocity. Because this core is much smaller in diameter than the full-caliber shell, it has less air resistance, and because it's so dense, it retains its kinetic energy remarkably well. All that energy is then concentrated onto a much smaller point of impact on the target's armor. This concentration of force is what makes the HVAP round so devastating. It's like taking all the force of a hammer blow and focusing it onto the tip of a nail. The result? A dramatic increase in armor penetration capability. For the 76mm M1 gun, the introduction of the M93 HVAP round was nothing short of revolutionary. Suddenly, a round that had struggled to reliably penetrate the Panther's glacis plate, or turret front, at 800 yards, could now, with HVAP, punch through that same armor at much greater distances, sometimes over 1,000 yards, with a much higher probability of success. This wasn't just a minor improvement, it was a qualitative leap. The engagement dynamic shifted. A Sherman, armed with HVAP, now had a credible chance of taking out a Panther in a head-on fight, something that was almost unthinkable just months before. It transformed the 76mm Sherman from a tank that was merely better than the 75mm version into a genuine Panther killer. At least with this specialized ammunition, however, HVAP rounds weren't a magic bullet that solved all problems. There were significant limitations. First and foremost was the scarcity of tungsten carbide, the primary material for the dense core. Tungsten was a critical strategic material, and its supply was limited. This meant HVAP rounds were always in short supply, issued sparingly, usually a handful of rounds per tank, to be used only against the heaviest German armor. Tank crews had to be incredibly judicious with their use. You didn't waste an HVAP round on a soft target or a Panzer IV. These were reserved for Tigers and Panthers. Secondly, while incredibly effective against flat or moderately sloped armor, HVAP rounds could sometimes be less effective against extreme angles, or if they struck armor that caused the penetrator to shatter rather than pierce cleanly. The specialized nature of the round meant it lacked an explosive filler. So if it did penetrate, it relied solely on kinetic energy and spalling shards of armor breaking off inside the tank to cause damage, rather than an internal explosion. Despite these drawbacks, the sheer increase in penetration was enough to make a profound difference. The deployment of EPSVAP rounds was also shrouded in a degree of secrecy. The Allies understood the psychological and tactical advantage this new ammunition provided. They didn't want the Germans to know what was hitting them, or to develop countermeasures too quickly. So, HVAP rounds were often distributed quietly, without much fanfare. 2 units on the front lines that were expected to encounter heavy German armor. This clandestine rollout further contributed to the shock and confusion that German tank crews would soon experience. The moment of truth, the true test of this new capability, came with the brutal winter offensive of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. This was Hitler's last desperate gamble, a massive assault through the Ardennes forest, aimed at splitting the Allied lines and reaching Antwerp. The German spearheads were composed of their best remaining panzer divisions, equipped with numerous Panthers and Tigers. They were confident, driving through the snow-covered forests, believing their superior armor would once again allow them to punch through the American defenses. They expected to encounter the same Shermans they had faced for months. Dangerous in numbers, but individually outmatched. But this time, something was different. As German Panthers advanced, they began to encounter a new and terrifying reality. Suddenly, the Shermans they had dismissed were hitting them with unprecedented force. Allied tank crews, now armed with a few precious HVAP rounds, were finally able to fight back on more equal terms. Stories from the Bulge speak volumes. German tank commanders, observing engagements, would see their Panthers, previously almost impervious from the front, taking hits that perforated their armor. The shock must have been immense. What was happening? What new weapon had the Americans developed? This wasn't the old 76mm round, they knew. This was something else entirely. Imagine a specific scenario, a composite of many such encounters during that harrowing winter. A column of German Panthers, their engines roaring, treads crunching through the snow, pushes through a narrow forest road. Their crews are alert but confident, knowing that any American tanks they encounter will likely be outgunned. Suddenly, hidden in the tree line, an M4A376W Sherman, its crew, cold but determined, spots the lead Panther. The Sherman commander, a veteran named Sergeant Miller, knows his tank's standard rounds won't do much good against that frontal armor. But he also knows he has 2 HVAP rounds left. "Loader, HVAP," he shouts, his voice tight with anticipation. The loader, Private Jenkins, quickly shoves the distinctive round into the breech. The gunner, Corporal Davies, adjusts his sights, his heart pounding. The Panther moves, its turret traversing, looking for targets. Davies fires. There's a deafening roar, a flash, and then, a split second later, a spark erupts on the Panther's glacis plate. A high-pitched whine cuts through the air, followed by a dull thud. Inside the Panther, the German crew is momentarily stunned. They expect the usual clang of a bouncing shell, perhaps a dent. But this time, something penetrated *. A jet of molten metal and deadly spalling rips through the interior, igniting ammunition, killing crew members instantly. The Panther grinds to a halt, smoke beginning to billow from its hatches. The German tank commander, who, moments before, had been scanning the tree line with disdain for the inferior American armor, is now dead, or scrambling to escape a burning wreck. He never expected that asterisk. He never expected the Sherman to hit him there with that kind of force. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the Ardennes, and later in the push into Germany, similar scenes played out. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For the Allied tank crews, it was a massive morale boost. They no longer felt completely helpless. They had a weapon, limited though it was, that could genuinely challenge the German giants. This gave them the courage to engage, to hold their ground, and to press the attack. For the German tank crews, it was a shattering blow to their confidence. Their belief in the invincibility of their frontal armor was shaken. They had to rethink their tactics, to be more cautious, to understand that the battlefield had changed. The Sherman, the tank they had so consistently underestimated, now carried a deadly secret that could rip through their steel. This forced them to adapt, but adaptation takes time, and time was a luxury the Germans no longer had. The widespread introduction of HVAP rounds for the 76mm Shermans, while not turning every Sherman into an untouchable monster, fundamentally altered the perception and reality of tank combat on the Western Front. It meant that the numerical superiority of the Allies, which was always immense, could now be brought to bear more effectively. A German Panther, previously able to hold off multiple Shermans from the front, now had to be wary. It couldn't just sit there and absorb hits. This allowed Allied tactics to become more aggressive, knowing that even if they couldn't always outmaneuver the Panther, they now had a puncher's chance in a frontal engagement. It contributed to the overall Allied momentum and the eventual collapse of German resistance. It's important to understand the broader context here. The Sherman versus Panther debate has always been a hot topic, often simplified to the point of distortion. The Sherman was never designed to be a heavy breakthrough tank like the Panther or Tiger. It was a medium tank, a workhorse, prioritizing reliability, ease of maintenance, and mass production. Its initial armament was adequate for its intended role. But when it came up against the highly specialized and technologically advanced German heavy tanks, it struggled. The 76mm gun was an essential upgrade. But it wasn't until HVAP rounds became available in significant numbers that the 76mm Sherman truly became a credible threat to the Panther's frontal armor at combat ranges. This wasn't just about raw power. It was about adaptation and ingenuity. The Allies, faced with a superior enemy weapon, didn't just give up. They iterated, innovated, and found solutions. The HVAP round was a testament to this relentless pursuit of advantage. It allowed the Allies to leverage their industrial might and their numerical superiority more effectively. The Sherman, often criticized and sometimes unfairly maligned, proved itself to be an incredibly adaptable platform. With the right ammunition, it could, and did, take on the best the Germans had to offer. It wasn't always a clean fight, and Sherman crews still faced immense dangers. But with HVAP, they had a fighting chance that had been denied to them for far too long. The legacy of the 76mm Sherman with HVAP rounds is a powerful one. It represents a critical turning point in the psychological and tactical landscape of tank warfare in World War II. It shattered the illusion of German tank invincibility, particularly for the Panther, and provided Allied tankers with the confidence and capability they desperately needed. It proved that even a seemingly outclassed weapon system, with continuous development and innovative ammunition, could be transformed into a formidable foe. The Germans never expected it. They never truly anticipated that the very tanks they dismissed would eventually carry the projectile that could rip through their mighty armor, forcing them to confront a harsh new reality on the battlefield. It's a reminder that in war, innovation, adaptability, and the relentless pursuit of a technological edge can turn the tide in the most unexpected ways. The Sherman, often underestimated, proved its worth not by being the biggest or most heavily armored, but by being versatile, numerous, and ultimately adaptable enough to carry the punch needed to win the war. If you want to dive deeper into the incredible stories of innovation and survival from World War II, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next video. The German High Command, initially, was baffled. Reports from the front lines, particularly during and after the brutal fighting in the Ardennes, painted a confusing picture. Their Panther tanks, these magnificent machines that had dominated so many engagements, were suddenly being penetrated from the front by American Shermans, not just occasionally, but with alarming regularity in some sectors. German intelligence officers, poring over battle damage assessments, examining destroyed Panthers, found peculiar entry holes, smaller than expected for such devastating damage, yet clearly indicative of a powerful high-velocity impact. The initial theories ranged from new, heavier American tanks to some sort of exotic supergun, or even just statistical anomalies from lucky shots. But as more and more reports came in, and as more German crews described the shocking effectiveness of these new projectiles, the truth began to slowly dawn. The Americans had developed a new type of ammunition. This wasn't just a minor upgrade. It was a significant shift in the ground war. For years, German tank doctrine had relied heavily on the superior protection and firepower of their heavy tanks. They were designed to engage at long ranges, to absorb hits that Allied tanks couldn't, and to deliver lethal blows in return. This superiority had been a cornerstone of their tactical planning. Now, that cornerstone was crumbling. The psychological impact on German tank crews was immense. Imagine being in a Panther, a tank you trust with your life, a tank that you believe to be nearly invincible from the front, only to suddenly find that belief shattered by a round from a Sherman, a tank you'd always considered inferior. The confidence that had been a powerful, unspoken weapon for German tankers eroded. The psychological edge, the feeling of untouchability, was gone. Doubt crept in, and doubt in combat can be as deadly as any enemy round. German tactical responses varied. Some units, particularly those that had experienced the brutal efficiency of HVAP rounds firsthand, began to adopt more cautious tactics. They tried to avoid direct, frontal engagements with Shermans, especially if they suspected the enemy might be carrying these new, terrifying projectiles. They emphasized ambush tactics, trying to lure Shermans into positions where their flanks or rear armor could be exposed, where even standard German rounds would be effective. They also tried to increase the distance of engagements, hoping that the HVAP's effectiveness would diminish over extreme ranges, though this was often wishful thinking given its high velocity. Some desperate measures were also tried in the field, like welding on extra armor plates or even concrete to vulnerable spots. But these were largely ineffective against HVAP and added unnecessary weight and strain to the already overstressed Panther chassis. The core problem was that they couldn't simply make their existing tanks immune, and they couldn't mass-produce a counterweapon fast enough. The scarcity of tungsten carbide, the dense material at the core of the HVAP round, was a critical factor. Tungsten is a rare metal, and during World War II, its primary sources were in politically complex regions. Portugal and Spain, for instance, were major sources, and both the Allies and the Axis vied for access to these supplies. The Allies had a more robust global supply chain, and while tungsten was still a bottleneck, they could procure enough to produce HVAP rounds in limited, but strategically significant quantities. The Germans, on the other hand, faced severe resource constraints as the war dragged on. Their access to tungsten was increasingly limited, making it almost impossible for them to replicate an equivalent round on a large scale, even if they had the design and manufacturing capabilities, which they largely did. This resource disparity was yet another facet of the overall Allied industrial superiority that slowly but surely ground down the German war machine. The physics behind the HVAP round's effectiveness against the Panther's sloped armor is fascinating. When a traditional armor-piercing, round AP, or a PCBC armor-piercing, capped ballistic capped hits, sloped armor, there's a phenomenon called normalization. The cap on these rounds helps them bite into the armor, effectively trying to turn the shell so it hits more squarely, reducing the effective slope. However, with very steep angles, or with very thick armor, even normalization wasn't enough for the 76AMZ's standard rounds against the Panther. The HVAP round, with its smaller, denser core, behaves differently. Because it's so small and fast, it concentrates all its kinetic energy on a tiny point. When it hits sloped armor, it's less prone to being deflected than a larger, softer round. Its sheer velocity and density mean it's almost trying to punch a hole straight through, rather than relying as much on normalization. This made it particularly effective against the Panther's glacis plate, which was designed to maximize deflection against conventional rounds. The energy transfer was so focused that it often overcame the armor's integrity, even at angles that would cause other shells to simply glance off. For the American tank crews, the HVAP rounds brought more than just increased penetration. They brought a renewed sense of purpose and confidence. No longer did they feel like they were merely delaying the inevitable when facing a Panther. Now, they had a fighting chance. This wasn't about turning every Sherman crew into reckless heroes, but about empowering them with the tools to do their job more effectively and to survive. The morale boost was palpable. Commanders could now plan engagements with a greater degree of flexibility, knowing that a frontal assault on a Panther was no longer a death sentence, but a calculated risk with a real possibility of success. This shift in confidence contributed significantly to the aggressive spirit of the American forces as they pushed deeper into Germany in 1945. They knew they still had to fight hard, but they no longer felt outgunned by the best German armor. The development and deployment of HVAP rounds also highlight a crucial aspect of American wartime production: adaptability. While the Sherman tank platform itself was a compromise, balancing protection, firepower, and mobility with mass production capabilities, it proved to be an incredibly versatile design. Instead of trying to design and produce an entirely new, heavier tank from scratch, a process that would have taken years and diverted critical resources, the Americans found a way to upgrade existing tanks with new ammunition. This evolutionary approach, rather than revolutionary, allowed them to quickly field a more capable weapon system using their existing industrial base. It was a pragmatic solution to a pressing problem, and it worked. The 76mm Sherman, already an improvement over the 75mm version, was truly unleashed by HVAP. However, it's also important to maintain perspective. While HVAP rounds made the 76mm Sherman a Panther killer, they didn't magically make the Sherman invulnerable or superior in every respect. The Panthers still retained advantages in armor thickness, gun power with its standard rounds, and often in optics and crew training, though American crews quickly gained experience. The Sherman still had thinner armor, and a hit from a Panther's 7.5 centimeters L-70 gun, especially with its own formidable AP rounds, was usually catastrophic. The term Panther killer refers specifically to the Sherman's newfound ability to reliably penetrate the Panther's frontal armor, thus equalizing the playing field in terms of offense, at least with this specialized ammunition. It meant that the German tank no longer held an almost undisputed advantage in frontal engagements. The battlefield became more dangerous for everyone. The impact of HVAP extended beyond just tank-on-tank engagements. It also influenced the role of tank destroyers, which were purpose-built to engage enemy armor. Vehicles like the M10 and M18 Hellcat, also armed with the 76mm gun, benefited immensely from HVAP, further enhancing their ability to take down heavy German tanks. This meant that the Allies had a broader array of vehicles capable of dealing with the Panther and Tiger, spreading the anti-tank capability throughout their forces and making it harder for German panzer groups to achieve local superiority. As the war entered its final stages in 1945, the increasing availability of HVAP rounds, combined with the sheer numerical superiority of Allied tanks and their dominance in the air, contributed significantly to the rapid collapse of German resistance. German forces were constantly on the defensive. Their supply lines were shattered, and their industrial capacity was crippled. But even in this dire situation, their tanks, particularly the Panther, remained dangerous. The fact that the Shermans could now effectively counter them in frontal engagements simply accelerated the inevitable. It meant fewer Allied tanks were lost in crucial battles, and the advance could continue with fewer costly delays. The story of the 76mm Sherman and HVAP rounds is a powerful narrative about technological surprise, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of an advantage in wartime. It's a testament to the ingenuity of engineers and the bravery of tank crews who had to face the most formidable armored vehicles of their time. It reminds us that even against seemingly insurmountable odds, innovation can turn the tide. The Germans learned a hard lesson about underestimating their adversaries' capacity for technological advancement, a lesson delivered in the form of a tungsten carbide dart traveling at blistering speed, ripping through the armor of their most feared tanks. It wasn't just metal against metal. It was ingenuity against dogma, and in the end, ingenuity prevailed. The Sherman, often seen as the underdog, proved that with the right tools, it was more than capable of rising to the challenge and helping to win the war. If you're interested in more stories about the hidden heroes and surprising turning points of World War II, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. The revelation of HVAP rounds wasn't a sudden, single moment for the German High Command, but rather a slow, agonizing realization that unfolded over weeks and months of brutal fighting. Initially, individual unit reports of Panther and Tiger frontal penetrations might have been dismissed as outliers, lucky shots, or perhaps even propaganda from demoralized American prisoners. But as the number of such reports grew, especially from the critical battles of the Ardennes, it became impossible to ignore. German intelligence and ordnance officers began the painstaking work of collecting shell fragments, examining entry holes on destroyed tanks, and interrogating captured Allied tank crews. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The entry holes were distinctively smaller than the caliber of the 76mm gun, yet the damage inside was devastating. This pointed unequivocally to a subcaliber high-velocity projectile. The analysis of these fragments, often tungsten carbide, and the accounts from captured soldiers, slowly pieced together the picture of the M93 HVAP round. The Germans, being pioneers in similar concepts themselves, with their early AP-40 rounds, understood the principles. They knew the devastating potential of such a projectile. The grim reality was that the Allies had not only developed it, but were deploying it, albeit in limited numbers. In the very theater where Germany was making its last stand, this discovery sent ripples of alarm through the German leadership. Their entire strategy on the Western Front had, to a significant degree, relied on the qualitative superiority of their tanks. They had fewer tanks than the Allies, but the belief was that each Panther or Tiger could take on multiple Shermans and emerge victorious. This equation was now fundamentally altered. If a Sherman previously considered a relatively easy kill from the front could now penetrate a Panther, then the numerical disadvantage became even more critical. It meant German tanks could no longer rely on their armor to absorb hits while they maneuvered or targeted weak spots. They were now vulnerable in ways they had not been before. The strategic implications were profound. Germany was already facing immense pressure on multiple fronts, with dwindling resources, a collapsing industrial base, and a severe shortage of trained personnel. The advent of HFAP meant that their most advanced and expensive tanks, which consumed vast amounts of precious steel, fuel, and labor, were no longer the impenetrable fortresses they were designed to be. This didn't render them useless, of course, but it significantly diminished their tactical advantage and increased their vulnerability. It forced German commanders to reconsider their deployments, to be even more conservative with their precious panzer divisions, and to accept higher attrition rates. Every Panther lost to an HVAP round was a colossal expenditure of resources that Germany simply could not replace. Furthermore, the Germans themselves had toyed with and developed similar ammunition, like the aforementioned AP-40, or even more advanced tungsten cord rounds for their larger anti-tank guns. But their ability to mass-produce such rounds was severely hampered by the Allied blockade and the scarcity of tungsten. While the Allies had access to global markets and could secure enough tungsten for their limited HVAP production, Germany was starved of this crucial resource. This meant that while they understood the threat and even the counter-technology, they were largely powerless to develop and deploy an equivalent countermeasure on a scale that would matter. It was a cruel irony for a nation that prided itself on its technological prowess. They had the ideas, but not the means. The emotional toll on German tank crews cannot be overstated. From the initial shock and disbelief, a sense of dread began to pervade the ranks. Propaganda had always emphasized the superiority of German engineering, especially their tanks. They were told they were fighting in the best machines, protected by the strongest armor. When that armor was suddenly breached by a tank they had been taught to despise as inferior, it was a profound psychological blow. It fueled a sense of helplessness, a feeling that no matter how good their tank, the enemy would always find a way to punch through. This fear, often unspoken, contributed to a decline in morale and confidence, making an already desperate situation even more bleak for the German tankers fighting in the final months of the war. They knew the odds were against them, but now even their most formidable assets seemed to be losing their edge. This dramatic shift in tank warfare also offers a crucial lesson for military historians and enthusiasts. who often get caught up in the paper statistics of tank comparisons. On paper, the Panther often looked superior to the Sherman in terms of frontal armor and gun penetration, and for a significant portion of the war, it was. But warfare is dynamic. It's not just about the static specifications of a vehicle. It's about continuous innovation, adaptability, and the relentless pursuit of tactical advantages. The Sherman, despite its perceived shortcomings, proved to be an incredibly adaptable platform. It could be upgraded, modified, and armed with new ammunition that fundamentally altered its combat capabilities. The HVAP round didn't make the Sherman a better tank than the Panther in every single metric, but it gave it the critical ability to directly challenge and defeat the Panther in a frontal engagement, which was often the decisive factor in battle. In the post-war analysis, the impact of HVAP rounds on the 76mm Sherman's effectiveness was sometimes overshadowed by the sheer numbers of Shermans and the overall Allied victory. But for those who fought in those winter months of 1944-45, the difference was stark. It redefined what a Sherman could do and forced a reevaluation of its role on the battlefield. It solidified the understanding that technological supremacy is fleeting and constant innovation is key to maintaining an edge. The story of HVAP reminds us that even against seemingly overwhelming odds, and with a tank often labeled as inferior, ingenuity and the clever application of new technology can dramatically shift the balance of power. It transformed a workhorse into a formidable challenger, leaving the Germans, who had so confidently dismissed it, utterly stunned and without a viable counter-strategy. It was a quiet revolution that played a huge role in speeding up the end of the war, one tungsten dart at a time. 4 more deep dives into the surprising turning points and forgotten technologies of World War II. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell.